The subcommittee on the Western Hemisphere will come to order. The purpose of this hearing is to analyze the impact of socialist policies in Central America and the Caribbean and how they undermine American interests in our hemisphere. Now I'm going to recognize myself for an opening statement. It's just going to be few comments. Thank you very much to Mr. Jacobstein for being here once again and enduring our questioning. I mean, it speaks so highly. I always say it speaks so highly of the American democracy, of having people of your stature, just like Mr. Howell, and thank you for both being here. I mean, do you foresee something like this in Venezuela or in Cuba or in Nicaragua, where the government officials have to come and answer questions to Congress? So I understand that this is fatiguing, and I'm sure that you don't necessarily like coming here, but I thank you very much, and you are a perfect testament of what this wonderful system stands for, democracy. So thank you for being here and enduring our questions. I'm sure that minds are going to be a little bit more rigorous or maybe not as pleasant as my ranking member. So thank you once again, and I will get to it very quickly. Now I recognize the ranking member, the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairwoman Al-Assad, for convening this hearing on U.S. policy towards Central America and Cuba, and welcome to our witnesses from the State Department and USAID. Great to see you all again. For decades, the United States viewed the hemisphere almost solely through the very Cold War lens that prioritized, almost at the expense of everything else, rooting out communism above all other considerations. And in many cases, the United States used its influence to suppress democratic movements and elevate governments that would protect our economic interests and side with the United States over the Soviet Union, often at the expense of their own citizens. While we won the Cold War, which is obviously very important and crucial not only for the United States, our allies in the world, we lost much of our credibility as defenders of democracy, as partners that would build ties based on our shared democratic values. So when we frame the challenges of the hemisphere through a left versus right or socialism versus capitalism lens, I believe we fail to fully analyze the modern day challenges that both Central America and the Caribbean face. For example, rampant corruption, democratic backsliding, attacks against the rule of law and an independent judiciary, lack of respect for human rights, increasing vulnerability to climate disasters due to climate change, exclusion of indigenous, Afro-Latino, and LGBTQI+ communities in the political process, lack of economic opportunity and slow recovery from COVID-19, widespread violence at the hands of transnational crime organizations and gangs. And to be clear, and I've said this many times in this committee, even before I was ranking member, I said it in the full committee, I believe that there are leaders on the left and the right in Latin America and around the world who have abused their people. And I actually think that when you get to a certain point of abuse and repression, it's no longer about political ideology. You become an autocrat. You become an autocratic leader. And we've seen that happen from both leaders on the right and leaders on the left. And I think that we should stand up against those leaders, wherever they come from. So, but also to be clear, it's not our role as Americans to choose the leaders for these countries. They have to go through a democratic process of choosing their leaders, or even to choose their economic systems. Again, the people have to put those systems in place, and they have to be committed to sustaining them. We must provide our democratic allies in both regions, including Costa Rica, Panama, and the Dominican Republic, the tools needed to strengthen their democratic institutions. That engagement was on full display in Guatemala, where the Biden administration made a dedicated and concerted effort to support Guatemala's democratic process and the peaceful transfer of power just 70 years after the United States overthrew the country's democratically elected president, Jacobo Arbenz. Undoubtedly, the leaders of Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua present the opposite version, one that suppresses the economic hopes and dreams of their people. But we must realize that engaging in Cold War-era rhetoric only helps authoritarians in all three countries continue to justify their denial of economic, political, and social rights. As y'all know, they often use us, the United States, as an effective foil for their own leadership and to bolster their own political fortunes in their countries. And where we're consistent, focused on today's challenges, and use sanctions carefully, we can make inroads in changing the behavior of these authoritarian leaders. But we have to focus the conversations on ways we can pragmatically work with countries in the region. That means partnering on anti-corruption and money laundering efforts, engaging with human rights instruments, driving public and private sector investment, and working on partnering on climate resiliency, among other things. That means cooperating on stopping the export of guns manufactured here in the United States that are used by gangs and transnational crime organizations in Haiti, Jamaica, Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras to exacerbate the various security and stability crises in the region. And that's why I introduced the America's Regional Monitoring of Arms Sales Act and the Stop Arming Cartels Act. Democratic values are what our country was founded upon. By focusing the conversation on what the United States can do today to partner with countries to foster inclusive, responsive, transparent, and democratic institutions, we can better promote a secure, stable, and free Central America and Caribbean. And that's what can help us address shared challenges like irregular migration and climate change. But we must do it together, and we must chart a path that focuses on the right set of priorities. With that, I yield back, Chairwoman.
Thank you, Ranking Member. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. Today, we have witnesses from the State Department and the USAID who cover American interests in Central America and the Caribbean for the Biden administration. Mr. Eric Jacobstein is a Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs at the United States Department of State. And Mr. Greg Howell is the Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau of Latin America and the Caribbean of the United States Agency for International Development. Thank you for being here. Your full statements will be made part of the record, and I'll ask each of you to keep it to 5 minutes in order to allow time for other members. I now recognize Mr. Jacobstein for his opening statement.
Chairwoman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I'm pleased to outline our overall approach to Central America and the Caribbean and to specifically discuss how the administration addresses Cuba and Nicaragua as we work to build a more democratic, prosperous, secure, and climate-resilient hemisphere. Our work in Central America is guided by the root causes strategy, which addresses long-term structural challenges. We're proud of our work on the root causes strategy, where we see results across the board, including in the fight against corruption. A key part of our strategy is the Vice President's Central America Forward initiative, which has generated $5.2 billion in new private sector commitments. In the Caribbean, our focus is on strengthening regional and civilian security cooperation and promoting economic prosperity, including through enhanced climate resilience and adaptation, energy independence, digital connectivity, and disaster preparedness. In Cuba, our policy focuses on support for the Cuban people, including their human rights and fundamental freedoms, and their political and economic well-being. The Cuban regime holds approximately 1,000 unjustly detained political prisoners behind bars. This includes hundreds of peaceful protesters from July 11, 2021. We continuously push for their unconditional and immediate release through bilateral and multilateral channels. Following the July 2021 protests, the administration imposed global Magnitsky sanctions on components and personnel of the Cuban military and the Ministry of the Interior responsible for the crackdown on these peaceful protesters. The State Department also imposed visa restrictions on 28 Cuban officials who enabled unjust detentions and sham trials of peaceful protesters. We continually make it clear to the Cuban government that human rights remain our top priority in the bilateral relationship. Communism failed in Cuba. The Cuban people are eager to control their own economic destiny. Today, more than 1/3 of Cuba's labor force works in one of the island's 11,000 plus private businesses. The Cuban people still view the United States as their preferred partner. We therefore cannot cede space to Russia or China and must continue to foster the growth of the private sector. We recognize that this will not turn Cuba into a capitalist democracy overnight, but we believe that Cuba's dynamic private sector offers ordinary Cubans opportunity for a better life. In Nicaragua, we're committed to promoting accountability for the Ortega Murillo regime and its brutal repression of civil society, its blatant disregard for human rights, its efforts to fuel irregular migration towards our southwest border, and its deepening ties with malign actors. Our efforts have helped to disrupt migratory flows and stymied access to resources that enable the regime to hold its grip on power. We continue to take aggressive measures to curb irregular migration throughout the hemisphere and disincentivize use of the Managua airport by those seeking to profit off vulnerable migrants. In November 2023, we implemented a new visa restriction policy that targets individuals running charter flights into Nicaragua designed primarily to facilitate irregular migration into the United States. We've used this new policy to hold bad actors accountable. Together with the Departments of Homeland Security and the Treasury, we issued a May 15 policy alert notifying commercial airline carriers, air charter companies, travel agents, and service providers of abuse by migrant smuggling and human trafficking organizations operating in and through Nicaragua. We also are focused on Russia's malign efforts to forge military and security relationships with countries in the region, which are aimed at undermining democracy and weakening Western influence. To address this challenge, on May 15th, the administration sanctioned the Russian Police Training Center in Managua for its role in enabling the Nicaraguan National Police's repression of the Nicaraguan people. The Biden-Harris administration continues to take actions to ensure the Nicaraguan regime's ill-gotten gains cannot be used to further its brutal repression of civil society. In March, we designated Nicaragua's Attorney General, who's played a role in the regime's property seizures. And in May, we designated 2 Nicaraguan gold mining companies that allowed the regime to profit from corrupt operations, adding to the list of 12 other entities and 50 individuals sanctioned by the Treasury Department under Presidential Executive Order 13851, which was amended by Executive Order 14088. In addition, the State Department has taken steps to impose visa restrictions on more than 1,400 individuals connected to attempts to silence the voices of the Nicaraguan people through repression, unjust detentions, and sham trials. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify here today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobstein, and I recognize Mr. Howell for his opening statement.
Chair Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thank you for the invitation to discuss USAID's work to advance economic opportunity, democratic values, and human rights in Central America and the Caribbean. In the decades that USAID has spent working in the region, we've seen the consequences of governments putting political agendas ahead of people, and we have learned how to address these challenges most effectively. We forge our partnerships not with specific political parties or administrations, but with people and institutions that bravely push for democratic change. This work is critical to local communities, to broader regional stability, and our own national security here at home. That's especially true of USAID's efforts in countries like Nicaragua, Cuba, and beyond. In Nicaragua, the Ortega Murillo regime's repressive or authoritarian rule is creating an increasingly non-permissive environment. With support from malign actors like the PRC in Russia, the regime is persecuting civil society actors, closing independent media outlets, and attacking those who speak out against the regime. USAID stands with the brave Nicaraguans, making their voices heard in support of democratic principles and human rights. Those efforts are especially important as USAID is one of the few donors supporting human rights defenders and implementing partners exiled abroad. Some of our deepest, most enduring foreign partnerships have stemmed from supporting other nations in their darkest hour. The work of these partners to call out the regime's abuses and advocate for democratic change is vitally important, and USAID is proud to stand with them. We support those who shine a light on injustice across Central America through the Voices Initiative, which brings together USAID, the State Department, and like-minded partners, so we can bring to bear all of the US government's tools to protect and promote civic space. At USAID, we've used our voice to protect our partners and those under threat, consulting closely with organizations to better understand risks they are facing and increasing our programming to meet some of those challenges. That includes our work offering at-risk human rights defenders, journalists, democracy activists, and anti-corruption champions with legal, psychosocial, and even relocation assistance, as well as fellowship opportunities in the US universities for those from Guatemala, Honduras, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. These regional efforts can ensure that those fighting for democracy have access to protection and can continue their work from outside of their countries if needed. And in Cuba, USAID operates within the parameters of the Cuban Democracy and Libertad Acts. For nearly 30 years, across 4 U.S. administrations, USAID has helped the people of Cuba in the face of oppressive government rule, supporting human rights, fundamental freedoms, and democratic values by strengthening civil society and providing improved access to information. USAID provides ongoing humanitarian assistance to political prisoners and their families, and to individuals who face hardship because of their political beliefs. There are currently more than 1,000 political prisoners in Cuba, and USAID provides assistance to approximately 800 of those individuals and thousands of Cuban families, and our assistance includes nutritional food items, vitamins, over-the-counter medicines, which are an invaluable lifeline to improve their physical and psychological well-being. USAID also promotes the free flow of information to, from, and within Cuba through greater access to independent news. Over the last decade, USAID has helped train hundreds of journalists whose work in major international outlets has counteracted information manipulation by the regime, documenting the dismal conditions on the island and highlighting the human rights violations by the regime. Those violations include forced labor, garnished wages, threats, and surveillance endured by Cuban doctors who serve in overseas medical missions. We are proud to support brave Cuban citizens who are risking their lives to advocate for a free and democratic future for their country. At a time of global power competition in the hemisphere and alarming examples of leaders in the region betraying democratic principles, it is in the interest of the United States to foster partnerships that work toward a more peaceful, democratic, prosperous, and stable Western Hemisphere. That is why it is critical USAID maintains a presence across the region and supports those who champion our shared values. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Howell, and now recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Well, I think that we agree on the end goal. So thank you. I like very much what you have been saying, so I just have a few questions here for you, and I'm going to start with Mr. Jacobstein. As you know, last month, Cuban regime officials were at the Miami airport inspecting something, a tour with TCA, and we just learned that last week there was a second secret visit of 4 Cuban regime officials to the same airport, the Miami International Airport, but this time 4 agreements were signed with the United States government. What type of agreements are those? Do you have any idea, Mr. Jacobstein?
Thank you very much for your question. So in terms of TSA, I would say TSA has coordinated with the Cuban Civil Aviation Authority and the Cuban Authority for Airport and Services for years on airport security measures and best practices, always in the U.S. interest.
But signing agreements with the Cubans, do you think the Cubans ever, once they sign, they ever fulfill their promise?
So I would just say in terms of the visit of the FAA, I don't want to speak on behalf of the Department of Transportation or the FAA.
Yeah, but you're at the State Department. You know everything that the United States government is doing vis-a-vis Cuba.
I would say the rationale for this visit is clear and very much in the U.S. national interest. We're interested in aviation
it's clear.
safety.
You're going to tell me that the Cubans are going to help the Americans fight terrorism if they are in the list of terrorist states? So maybe, and maybe you can clarify this, I'm not sure why maybe you guys are trying to create a scenario where you can take Cuba off the list of terrorist countries. Do you think that's what you guys are doing? By granting by saying, you see the Cubans are here in Miami and they're signing agreements and they're going to help us fight terrorism. Tell me.
Absolutely not.
Oh, good. So you're not going to take Cuba off the list of terrorist countries? Is that what you're telling me?
You asked me about these visits. These visits are intended to promote aviation safety and security, especially for U.S. passengers. That is fundamental and critical to us. We want all these passengers, including Cuban Americans who go back and visit their family members,
now,
to be safe.
I agree with that, but at the same time, you're talking to Cuba officials. So go back to, is not what Cuba wants, which we know what they want, is what the United States, in this case, the Biden administration is looking for, which I really would like to be wrong in thinking that you're just laying the groundwork so you can take Cuba off that list. And I just want you to tell me that I'm wrong. Am I wrong? You're not planning to take it off?
So as I've said before, U.S. law establishes specific statutory criteria for rescinding a state-sponsored terror
I
designation.
am not asking you that. I'm asking you something different. Do you think the State Department at this hour is creating the conditions and the scenario in order to take Cuba off the list of terrorist
At this time, there is no review ongoing on
Say that again?
state-sponsored. At this time, there is no ongoing review on the state-sponsored terror designation.
But you have until July 12th to start that ongoing, or to start that investigation or that study, because you have a specific date. So you're telling me right now, of course, is what? Is July, is June, what, 28th? But you have until July 12th. So what are you guys planning to do July 13th?
There's no specific time frame for a review, but at this.
Oh, yes, 6 months before. You need to review, according to the law, you need to review 6 months before, and then you take them off or you leave them on. So July 12th would be the day.
I don't think that's accurate to say that July 12th is the day, but I just would say again that should any review happen, any future review would be based on the law and criteria established by Congress.
Can you just ask yes or no if you guys are thinking about taking Cuba off the list? And the only reason why I'm insisting on this is because if you were to do that, you're giving that cruel and despicable regime oxygen to do what you just said right now. 1,000 political prisoners are in jail just because they went out and they claimed libertad. So can you tell me yes or no? Are you guys thinking about taking Cuba off the list or not?
I would just say again, any review of Cuba's status on the SST, should one happen, would be based on the law and the criteria established
That
by
means
Congress.
yes, you are thinking about doing it.
It does not.
And that is very bad. But we will talk about it further. Now, but I want to congratulate you at the same time because there's a new application on your phone called which I'm not going to say it, but it's very good. And there's good news for the Cubans because now, for what I hear coming from the Biden administration, you're going to have an app that the Cubans are going to be able to use. And then when ETETSA shuts down, then this app is going to allow the Cubans to connect to another form of internet. And that's great. So, en español, para los cubanos, no están solos. Aquí en el Congreso estamos haciendo todo lo posible para que haya una aplicación en el teléfono y que se puedan conectar en el internet cuando ETETSA tumba la señal. Do you know anything about that?
I'm not tracking this specific issue, but happy to discuss our efforts.
But you just
related to
said
that.
it right now that you wanted digital. You said digital connectivity. That's number one, and Mr. Howell said it too. If you give connectivity to the Cubans, you're giving them the possibility of them demonstrating in the streets of Havana, and everyone will see them, even though they're being beaten by the regime. That's great. Connectivity, that's all we need. Do you agree?
Yes, the administration supports the Cubans' people access to an open, interoperable, secure, and reliable internet. U.S. regulations already allow for certain activities to support the Cuban people's access to information on the internet, and the actions announced by OFAC, by the Treasury Department, on May 28th, including supporting greater access to U.S. internet services, applications, e-commerce platform that builds on that support. And then on top of that, I would say our programs through the Bureau of Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor, they increase Cubans' on-island ability to access information and to communicate freely and securely using digital security best practices and censorship circumvention tools. So this is very much at the top of our mind.
Good. And we're going to work with it because I'm just saying it to you and to the Cuban people who are watching this hearing that there's hope coming. And I don't want to extend my time too much, and I don't want to fatigue my colleagues' patience. Just one more, Honduras. The State Department was supposed to give Congress a report on democracy in Honduras. It was due last week. What happened?
I will follow up on the status of the report as soon as I'm back.
All right, but why haven't you finished it?
Sometimes these reports lag in time for a number of reasons, but I don't have anything further than that,
Well,
but happy to provide
you're not
that.
giving me, but I'm giving, unfortunately, Madam President Xiomara Castro, I'm giving her an F on the report because democracy is not being protected in Honduras, and I'm going to give you two examples. Madam President just honored Nicolás Maduro, the highest honor of Hondurans can give. How embarrassing for the Hondurans, the Francisco Morazan medal to Nicolás Maduro, really. And Madam President is China's best friend in the region. And not only that, she has established colectivos, Chavez style. You know what those are? That she forms sort of a paramilitary, a group of people with guns so they can go and attack the police. So in my book, she gets an F. What do you say about that?
Thank you very much. So our goal...
I'm sure she thanks you too.
Our goal through the root causes strategy in Central America is to focus on promoting democracy, prosperity,
But talk
security.
to me about Honduras specifically. How do you view what she's doing?
Specifically in Honduras, there are a number of areas in which we cooperate on migration management, on investment facilitation. We recently signed a memorandum of understanding on gender-based violence. Yes, there are challenges as well. And for example, just last fall, there were violent attacks on members of Congress during the selection process for the Attorney General. And so we, in response, used the Section 353 report to put a sanction in place for Ricardo Arturo Salgado Bonilla, who's the current minister
Are
of
you sending,
Strategic
Madam
Planning.
President, the message that she should not be messing with Honduras democracy, and she should not be moving to the left like Chavez, Maduro, Ortega, Fidel? Are you sending that message?
Throughout the region, we absolutely focus on the need to have
And what do they respond in exchange?
good governance is critical in all the countries of Central America.
But
and
what
that is
do they respond? What do they tell you when you send that very noble message?
We have countless conversations. I won't get into the internal diplomatic conversations, but this is something that's top of mind, along with our focus on shared economic prosperity, anti-corruption, migration management,
Of course.
and a host of issues.
Finally, another 30 seconds, Nicaragua. As you said, Rosario and Daniel, they have a big piñata. They are now, Nicaragua has become this platform for people to arrive to come to the United States. We're talking about 1,000 flights. Each person pays $10,000. You've had 300,000 people from all over right here. You have people coming from Morocco, from Senegal, from Libya, from India, from Tajikistan, from Kazakhstan. You have 300,000 people coming to Nicaragua, and happens that 8 of them were terrorist members of ISIS. They wound up in New York. So what list would you put Ortega on?
Absolutely. This is top of mind for us. No one should profit off of vulnerable
What
migrants.
are you going to do about it?
We've taken a number of steps, which I outlined in my...
Tell me 2 of them.
For example, we implemented a new 3C policy Secretary Blinken announced in November 2023, in which we're revoking visas for charter airlines who are facilitating irregular migration through Nicaragua. We put in place a number of sanctions just on May 15th,
Why don't
which
you
I
put
mentioned.
them on the list of terrorist countries as well? Can you do that? Put Nicaragua? I mean, they're sponsoring terrorists. They're letting terrorists go through to come here.
Happy
we
to
do
take
that?
back your recommendation. I would say that
Now,
we've
don't you
taken a
think
number of...
would you agree with that?
We've taken a number of very robust steps to deal with the irregular migration challenge, and you've seen a reduction in the charter flights. It's still a huge challenge, and I'm working very closely, in particular with commercial airlines, the International Air Transport Association, on the margins of the Los Angeles Declaration ministerial meeting that Secretary Blinken attended in Guatemala, put out a robust statement on the work they're doing. So we're working both inside of Nicaragua and outside of Nicaragua to address this critical challenge.
Thank you for your efforts. I yield back. And sorry, I
No, that's all
appreciate your patience, Ranking Member, now Representative Castro.
Thank you, Chairwoman.
I now recognize the Ranking Member for 5 or more minutes.
Thank you. Eric, you're really earning your government salary today. I guess I do have a question, but first let me speak to the Cuba issue. And Chairwoman, I respect, she obviously has a very strong perspective, very strong convictions, and I know many people in her district agree with her. I guess I want to present a bit of an alternative because she knows we disagree on this. Since the early 1960s, we tried one thing, which was to distance ourselves from Cuba, sanction Cuba, to isolate Cuba, and the result was that the Castros stayed in office for decades and decades and decades, and the people in Cuba were impoverished. The society fell behind other nations of the world, even though it has incredible potential as a nation, and the people have incredible potential. And I think it comes down to whether you believe going forward we should stick to those 1960s policies, or whether we would have more influence on the direction of Cuba. Again, not picking their leaders or picking how they do things, just like we don't need to do for any other nation, but have some influence in the direction they take. I think that the answer is engagement. And I know the designation of terror came in the last week, I think, of the Trump administration, that the Secretary of State made that designation, literally on their way out. And so I hope that you all will undertake that review. I think it is a necessary review. And again, it comes down to me whether we're going to take a different approach than we took for decades and decades that obviously has not worked. Or whether we're going to leave Cuba in the hands of nations like China and Russia. And I think that's why I was supportive of what President Obama was trying to do in his second term, which was to normalize diplomatic relations, to start preparing at that time for the departure of both the Castros and be ready at that time, in that moment, to build a closer relationship with the Cuban people and the Cuban government to try to make the country more democratic and to take a different course. It didn't end up panning out that way, obviously. In fact, when President Trump came in, like I said, in their last week, they designated the country as a state sponsor of terror. And that is where the Biden administration took over, and that's where it finds itself now. But I hope that we will take a different course. But I did have a question I wanted to ask you. I'm concerned about the ongoing efforts to undermine and discredit the convictions of the 8 individuals found guilty of the murder of human rights and environmental defender Berta Cáceres. As you know, the appeals to those convictions are ongoing and are overdue for a judgment. And I'm concerned, as are other members of Congress, that the judges are coming under undue pressure to free the convicted corporate executives that ordered that murder. Is the United States closely tracking the court case, and will you commit to pushing back against false statements regarding the facts of the case?
Thank you very much for that question, Ranking Member Castro. And yes, we are tracking the case and the ongoing concerns for environmental defenders in Honduras, and happy to work closely with you, your office, and our embassy in Honduras to ensure that we follow up and ensure a free and fair trial on this.
And we're now 2 years in the administration of President Castro there, who was elected with the backing of much of civil society. What do you see as the trends for the safety and freedom of civil society in Honduras?
Thank you very much. We certainly work very closely with Honduran civil society on a number of issues. I was in Honduras earlier this year, met with members of civil society. I would say in particular, met with members of the Griffin community, LGBT community who feel under threat. So I feel there's much more we can do. The embassy works very closely to ensure that these individuals, these groups have our support. But we do think there's more that can be done, including through the human rights protection mechanism in Honduras. So we'll continue to push hard on that.
And then one more question for now. In February 2023, the United States worked to free 222 Nicaraguan political prisoners who were imprisoned by the Ortega Murillo regime. In fact, we flew those people directly to the United States on a U.S. government-funded flight. And many of those individuals have been rendered stateless by the regime, and they've applied for asylum, so they're not at the risk of deportation. I understand that of the 160 individuals who applied for asylum, only one has had an interview so far. So I wanted to ask you, will you work with your colleagues at DHS to prioritize their asylum applications or provide them advanced parole before the end of the year, especially given our role in bringing them to the United States?
Thank you very much. So the State Department and USAID allocated significant resources to enable a safe transportation and immediate to near-term care for the 222 individuals released from prison in Nicaragua. However, we don't have the resources or mandate to provide the long-term care some of the 222 require. But in terms of your specific question, since the arrival of the 222, the State Department has worked closely with USCIS to facilitate the travel of immediate family members of these individuals from Nicaragua to the United States through lawful pathways. This will continue as more members of the 222 become sufficiently established in the United States. So in terms of those who are in process, once members of the 222 submit their asylum applications, the State Department can provide comments on specific asylum applications to USCIS or to the Department of Justice, and happy to work with you to follow up on the specific procedures.
Thank you. I yield back, Chairwoman.
You had another 5 minutes. All right. Now I recognize Representative Self for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. First question for you is, what is the political trend? We heard a lot about inputs from you. What do you think is the political trend in Central America, toward or away from democracy? How do you judge the trend?
Thank you very much. So it's a mixed bag. I think that we've seen some positive trends, and our goal is to meet partners where they are, always in the U.S. interest, under the root causes strategy, to work together to reduce irregular migration.
Okay.
I would say one very positive example is in Guatemala, where we've worked very closely with President-elect, with now President Revelo.
Okay, so we've got a mixed bag.
Yep.
Okay, thank you. The ruling parties in Honduras, Nicaragua, and Cuba are each members of the Foro de Sao Paulo. I quote from last year. This is their statement. The U.S. project of domination over Latin America and the Caribbean is facing an environment marked by threats to its hegemony. That's us. The dispute with China and the growing presence of progressive or leftist political forces in regional governments, Central America and the Caribbean, constitute an important challenge to a country, that's us, affected by multiple crises that are manifesting themselves in the political, economic, social, and cultural spheres. Now, you said earlier that, and I'm going to ask you if you believe that the Biden administration can pull these three countries out of the orbit of the Foro. You said before, and I want to get to this because this is important, that you would conduct this review under the guidelines set by Congress, the law set by Congress. Why should this committee believe that? Because the view is that the Biden administration on this, what you call irregular immigration, we consider that lawless. There is no attempt to secure the southern border. So do you believe, and there are other examples around the world that I could give you, do you believe that the administration believes, that's you, do you believe that you can pull Honduras, Nicaragua, and Cuba out of the Foro?
This is an independent forum, so I wouldn't say that we would have a role to do that, but venues like the Sao Paulo Forum could have the potential to play a role in advancing hemispheric progress, but only if they move away from past criticism and toward consensus building. So the comments that have been referenced, we find unconstructive in many ways.
You find not constructive. And yet, you give, in fact, you've requested in the FY 2025 budget request, millions of dollars for these three countries. How do you reconcile that? You admit it's an independent forum, you're not going to pull them out. How do you reconcile that? Because the root strategy that you have here, the root cause strategy that you have here, how are you going to change their behavior? That is the bottom line question.
So the root causes strategy provides resources to non-governmental organizations, implementers throughout the region. This is not a blank check to governments. There's very little money that goes directly to governments themselves. We work with governments, we partner where we can and where we should, but these are resources that are intended to support society as a large.
So I'll go back to one of your colleagues, and I don't remember who it was, said that it's true, we are no longer the chief trading partner with Central and South America. China is. We're the chief finance partner with Central and South America. So I don't see how you are going to influence these governments if you're simply giving the people who are suffering, the NGOs under them, money, and yet you're not working to change them. And I say again, I don't know what confidence we can have in the administration of doing it under the laws that Congress passes. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman Self. Now I recognize Ranking Member Castro for another round of questioning.
Thank you. We all agree that democratic backsliding, regardless of political leanings or ideology, is a concern in the region. In his war on gangs, Salvadoran President Bukele has filled the largest prison in Latin America by undermining the country's checks and balances, violating human rights, and bypassing the judicial system in the name of restoring law and order. I wanted to ask you, Mr. Jacobstein, does the United States remain concerned about respect for human rights and the rule of law in El Salvador?
Thank you for that important question. We'll continue to call for progress on democracy, human rights, inclusive governance, transparency, and the rule of law during President Bukele's second administration. So, I'd say it is true that during El Salvador's state of exception, reported gang crimes have dropped significantly. But these gains were achieved at the price of respect for fair trial guarantees and principles of justice. Prison conditions, historically challenging, worsened. So we raised these concerns with Salvadoran officials, particularly prison conditions for minors, and we continue to urge the government of El Salvador to end the state of exception, both publicly and privately.
And look, I think the election and also the polls have shown that the president there has been quite popular with the people. And I think there is relief among the public that gang violence is down. And why wouldn't there be relief? But as a nation, we've always stood for the fact that processes matter and respect for the rule of law matters. And there are strong indications that people who are innocent and not attached to any gangs have been rounded up in this dragnet that's going on in El Salvador. And this is an example. When I talk about being critical of leaders on the left or the right, this is an example, I think, of where I feel as though if this were a leftist leader in Latin America that had imprisoned 2% of his or her population, there would be a lot of people demanding that we do something about that and that we take every action in terms of sanctions and everything else to stop it. But here we have a leader on the right who is now in prison by many estimates, about 2% of the population, and there isn't much said about it. And so, yeah, that's deeply concerning, the differential treatment in leadership, and begs the question whether we're going to consistently apply our values as a country to leaders, depending on where they are, or not depending on where they are on the ideological scale or spectrum. Well, let me ask a follow-up on that. President Castro of Honduras recently announced plans to build a 20,000 capacity mega prison as part of a larger crackdown on gang violence, raising concerns that Honduras will follow El Salvador in its approach. Do you share those concerns, and have you communicated them with the government of Honduras?
Thank you very much. When it comes to states of exception, just as in El Salvador, we always believe a state of exception must indeed be exceptional. So it's certainly something that we've communicated throughout the region, that we understand the need for governments to respond to security situations in their country, to respond to the trauma of years of gang violence, but that due process is critical.
And that state of exception is essentially an emergency position, right? Not something that should last permanently there.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I yield back.
Thanks to you, Ranking Member. Now I will recognize Representative Self for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In this discussion that you just had, I would quote President Reagan, "There is no left or right. There is only up toward maximum individual freedom consistent with civil society, or there's down to the ash heap of history." So I think freedom ought to be your message, freedom for the people of Central America. And regardless of who that is, the message I would ask you to send to the people of Cuba, each of these countries, is freedom, that we will stand with them for freedom, for liberty, for personal responsibility and liberty. With that, I yield back, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Thank you, Representative Self. And now I recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. Just wanted to continue with what I was asking you and go back now in depth that we have a little bit more time about Nicaragua. It's embarrassing what they're doing. It's embarrassing. And that we have allowed it. We're talking about 300,000 people from all over the world coming to Nicaragua, 1,000 flights in the last year, $10,000 per person, and we have terrorist cells in New York and Philadelphia. So in reality, what can we do to send the message to Daniel Ortega, who has transformed that country into a tyranny in the last 4 years, that he needs to stop this? He's making a big dough, big piñata out of this. So level with me. What can we really do?
Thank you. So we're taking aggressive action in this space.
And what does aggressive action mean?
President Biden issued an executive order in October 2022, which we implemented this year in May to the Treasury Department to sanction 2 entities in the gold sector. This is a sector that is enriching Ortega Murillo's regime. So that is one piece of it. You've seen the sanctions, countless visa revocations, additional sanctions on his Attorney General, on the Russia Training Center.
But you know, Mr. Jacobstein, that those people do not want to come to Saks or go to Disney World. So they don't really care about coming to the United States. It's CAFTA DR that will hurt them. And I hate to say this because it's not very good for the average Nicaraguan. But we got somehow stop these people. You know Rosario Murillo is evil. You know this. And look what they're doing to us. And Mexico is letting them come through, but it comes through Nicaragua. So tell me, what else can we do? Because we don't want, can you imagine? I don't even want to say it in public. Please tell me.
Thank you. So we share your concerns. We're extremely concerned, and that's why we have taken aggressive actions both on, you mentioned the visa policy, that's one piece, but also sanctions that get them in their pocketbook, and that's what happened with the gold sector sanctions. Sanctioning the Russia Training Center was also really important because that went after their efforts to, essentially train others in the hemisphere on Russian police tactics. So we took these actions, but then also, as I said, we're working to put in penalties against the regime itself. We're also working outside of Nicaragua. That's through the visa revocations for executives of charter airline companies, through our good collaboration with commercial airlines to work closely with them. So we're working across the board to address this issue. And our diplomatic efforts, honestly, with foreign governments and outreach have helped prevent numerous charter flights bound for Nicaragua from Africa, Central Asia, the Middle East. Our embassy in Managua, our embassies around the world are sharing information with each other to ensure that these charter flights stop.
So maybe we can send the message to, I'm just going to translate what you said. We can send the message to the private sector, meaning those charter companies, that they should not be engaging in business anymore with the Ortega regime.
Absolutely. Our
But
diplomats,
that's exactly what you're doing.
our diplomats do that.
How can we help you send that message loud and clear?
We would appreciate that. Well, we're happy to work with you and your office in finding
Of
ways
course.
to collaborate. We do feel that a number of charter airlines have moved out of this space, but in a sense, it's whack-a-mole.
We need
And
all of
so we
them
need
out
to
of the
continue
space.
continue to push. So we'd be happy to work with you on that.
Good. Now, let's go back to Honduras. You know that Honduras, I just told you that I give her an F, unfortunately, because I have a lot of thousands of Hondurans in my district. Those are hardworking people. They don't deserve this type of political elite. Now, recently, the president has allowed 100 Cuban doctors to get to Honduras. We know that the Cuban doctors are treated as slaves. USMCA says that you cannot treat any type of professional as this type of, or be involved in this type of human trafficking. El Colegio Médico de Honduras opposed their presence. This Congress passed a law that requires the State Department to cancel the United States visas of any government official who is involved in trafficking Cubans or any other nationality. So, are you concerned about the fact that the Cubans are now being enslaved by Xiomara Castro's government?
We're very concerned about Cuba's medical missions. You mentioned the FY24 Appropriations Act, which called for a report listing the countries and international organizations for which the Secretary's credible information are directly paying the government of Cuba for coerced and trafficked labor of Cuban medical professionals. So after the president—
Interrupting you, I mean, you
Yeah.
understand that that money doesn't get to the Cuban doctor's pocket, right?
Yes.
So that government goes, that money goes to the Cuban government. So you pay $1,000 for one Cuban, $5,000, and the Cuban doctor gets $200.
Absolutely. And we continue to urge countries considering hiring Cuban workers to keep agreements transparent and respect human rights and internationally recognized labor rights.
But why don't we cancel their visas?
So
That will be a very loud message. Would you consider that?
Thank
Any
you.
Honduran government official that is involved in the human trafficking of Cuban doctors or any other doctor doesn't come to the United States.
yeah,
Do you like that idea?
absolutely. We'd be happy to look into any information you have on individuals. The department at this time does not have.
Starting with the president, just like you guys did with Jamate in Guatemala. Cancel their visa. Don't you see that everyone wants to enjoy the American dream and come and enjoy what we have? So we got to use that in order to help other people. The Cubans, the Nicaraguans, the Hondurans, the Guatemalans, the Salvadorians, everybody is entailed.
Happy to receive any
Do you
information
agree
have.
with that?
We'd be happy
I
to
need you to do that because that way we're sending a very strong message to these governments that they cannot be playing around and doing what they're not supposed to do when it comes to human rights.
Yeah, happy to receive information on this on any of these issues and to follow up with you.
All right, now, finally, let's go back to Cuba and connectivity. You know that I've always said that the Biden administration, after July 11th, the best thing that it can do for the Cubans is to give them connectivity. You know very well, and the Biden administration has been there with the Cubans, and you have recognized that they have come out into the streets just simply screaming libertad, right? And connectivity is, if they could have connectivity, which is having internet, once ETETSA, which is the Cuban internet company, shuts down, the average Cuban would go back into the streets, demonstrate, and at least know that if they're being beaten, at least the world will see them. That's what I would need, and I represent the Cuban exile community in Miami. Connectivity. What do you know about this new app?
As I mentioned previously, I don't have information on this app, but would be happy to follow up. I would just say more generally.
What do you mean you don't have information on this app? This app is it's out there, and we're about to announce it.
Look forward to learning more. I would say it's important to note that despite the Cuban government's efforts to control access to information, millions of Cubans are online every day, accessing a whole variety of information, including our very active U.S. Embassy.
But when they go out in Cienfuegos or here or there, you know what the Cuban regime does? They shut it down. How do I know? Because I have people in Cuba telling me, oh, they just shut down internet, and it's just text. Obviously, video is no good because they're going to see how the repressive apparatus is beating them and breaking their necks on the streets.
And this is precisely why our programs increase Cubans' on-island ability to access information, to communicate freely and securely using digital security best practices and censorship circumvention tools. So this is top of mind for us.
All right, good. I'm glad that it's a priority for me too. And finally, I just want to go, Mr. Howell, you have not been able, I'm very sorry that I've not spoken with you or have given the opportunity to speak a little bit more. But, you know, when I was a news reporter for Univision, I was the Central American bureau chief, and I lived in El Salvador and Honduras. And I can say to you that USAID is like God the Father. Everyone loves USAID because it brings the best of the American system, not only the American dollars. So I have high regard for USAID. I have been hearing lately that within Central America, the USAID policies have changed. What do I mean by that? That sometimes you give money to those programs that do not necessarily are aligned with what the local people want. That we're talking too much about cultural and social and sexual orientations. And basically what the Guatemalans and the Hondurans, what they want is a job, be able to learn a trade, be able to have a little loan so they can live their little American dream in their country. So what do you say to that, to those criticisms that I am sure you have heard them?
Thank you, Chairwoman Salazar. Actually, in Honduras, we are working closely with the people of Honduras, and we've worked there for over 60 years and proud to work with civil society groups like the National Anti-Corruption Council, which has actually exposed cases of corruption very recently with a former Vice Minister of Security under the previous administration. We also work to prevent and stop gender-based violence, which is a
Why
terrible
don't you give me
scourge in
two
the-
or three programs that are the top programs, let's say, in Guatemala, in Honduras? Those two countries. Top programs that are where you are allocating the most resources in.
Well, as far as one of our success stories, certainly working with the private sector, USAID has worked with 70,000 coffee farming families. That's over half of
Good.
all coffee farming families. And with international buyers, are exporting high-quality Honduran coffee internationally,
Good.
creating jobs and improving the incomes of farming families.
What else?
What else? We're actually working closely with the Labor Ministry of Honduras on legal pathways for H-2 visas. We've tripled the number of H-2 visas emitted from Honduras to allow Hondurans to work ethically and temporarily here in the U.S. under this Lawful Pathways program that benefits not only the Honduran people, but also U.S. consumers and U.S. companies.
Sure. What about Guatemala?
Well, glad you asked. I worked there for 4 years, and we worked very successfully as well with the private sector in Guatemala, training youth, preventing violence, working with civil society, and as well the municipalities across Guatemala. Climate change is another key aspect of our work, trying to maintain and save the Mayan Biosphere Reserve in the northern part of the country.
But have you heard the same thing that I've been hearing? And I'm not being so critical because I said I know USAID is not perfect, but it brings the American spirit to these countries, that sometimes you are putting too much emphasis on those programs that have nothing to do with the sensitivities of the place.
No, appreciate that. We appreciate feedback all the time. But currently,
You haven't heard it?
under the President Arevalo,
Yeah?
he just assumed office, so we're pleased to
No,
just...
but before Arevalo, we were there doing Jamate and do everybody else. I mean, like you said, 70 years before. So you have not heard the criticism that I've heard, but I'll share that with you if you want to in private. So maybe you can hone in on those programs according to what the local people want.
No, appreciate that, ma'am.
Good. I will work with you and try to help you because I know the area very well. So thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you
and
very
to you,
much.
Mr. Jacobstein. So I think that the clock saved you, right? I thank the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. The members of the subcommittee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and we will ask you to respond to them in writing. And pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statements, questions, and other materials for the record, subject to the length limitations. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. Thanks again.